Hello everybody, this is John Mark Johnson Jr. again, host of Reformed GGA, and I am here to talk to you guys about bullets and cartridges. This is our next video in our double action, single action autoloader series, and this time we are talking about the kinds of bullets that we shoot. We're not going to be talking about caliber per se. We'll discuss that in another video. Right now we're just discussing the different designations for the different kinds of cartridges that we might put in our autoloader. Now, as most of you guys will probably know by now, my handgun of choice is usually going to be some kind of a 9mm, and so most of the rounds that I have here, not all of them, but most of the rounds that I have here are going to be 9mm rounds. But I still have a pretty wide array of them, so that'll at least give you an idea of the different kinds of rounds that are out there. Let's go ahead and start with probably one of the very best kinds of rounds to get yourself in the very first place. If you're someone who's relatively new to firearms and you don't know a whole lot about how your particular gun works or how to load and unload and all those kinds of things, you're going to need to practice those kinds of things. And it's nice to be able to practice with something that simulates live ammunition but doesn't have any of the risks of live ammunition, namely the gun going off. And that is where rounds like this come in. This is a dummy round. In particular, this is an A-zoom snap cap. You guys have seen this in this series before. I will often use these when I want to do manipulations with the gun on camera to show you how different things work, but I don't want to have any of the risks associated with live ammunition. This is completely inert. There is no powder charge in here. There is no actual primer. There's just a little bit of resin on the back end. That is not an actual primer. It's just a bit of resin. It is literally impossible for this thing to go off because there's nothing to go off. And so I can run this through the gun, I can do any manipulation that I need to, I can practice using the gun in that way with it. Absolutely fantastic thing to have. These also can be used for dry fire practice, and as we progress through the video series we'll talk about dry fire practice more. This particular brand, this particular type is not ideal for dry fire practice just because that resin end will get worn out after about 250 times of dry firing it, but they are very useful for those kinds of things. There are other brands out there that make a little bit better ones that actually have a little spring-loaded plunger in the back end that will last considerably longer. But the basic idea behind dummy ammunition is as a training aid that doesn't have any of the risks associated with live ammunition. And for someone who's just getting into firearms, this can be a very useful tool. In addition to that, it's also a good tool for storing the gun. When you store the gun with particular kinds of guns, it can be somewhat hard to drop the hammer. Dropping the hammer sometimes can cause firing pin damage if the firing pin doesn't have anything to strike. Well, putting a dummy round in the chamber so that you can pull the trigger and the hammer drop safely is a good thing to have. So they're used for storage, they're used for training purposes, they can be used for dry fire practice. These are a really good investment if you're just getting into firearms. And even for people who have been using firearms for a while, these are still a really good investment. Alright, so first kind of bullet that I would recommend that people get is the dummy round, which is basically a non-bullet bullet. Alright, so dummy rounds. First and foremost on the list, and this isn't just an A-zoom snap cap. Sold at a lot of different retailers. Alright, then after that, after you've trained with the dummy rounds, you've gotten used to how to load the magazines and how to load the gun and unload the gun and press check and all those things that we've talked about in previous videos. Eventually you're going to get out to the point where you're going to actually want to go out and shoot, and you're going to need some ammunition for that. However, if you're going out to practice your shooting, you don't necessarily want to spend top dollar on these rounds. And because of that, you're going to need to find some kind of practice ammunition. And there are lots of different kinds of practice ammunition that are out there. Most of them are what we call full metal jacket. I'll take an example here. This is one of my favorites that belong to this category of training ammunition. This particular one is a Remington green and white box 115 grain 9mm load. Now, of course, you guys will probably have different handguns and different calibers, so on and so forth. But this is one that I found that works for me, and this is kind of on the upper tier of practice ammunition. This one is somewhat expensive. It depends on where you buy them. But the price can change quite a little bit. But the main point is that these are considerably cheaper than actual defensive rounds, and we'll talk about those in a few moments. Very much so cheaper. Oftentimes like 3 times cheaper, sometimes up to 5 times cheaper, sometimes even a little bit more, but usually somewhere between 3 and 5 times cheaper for these particular rounds than doing the actual defensive rounds. So much cheaper to go and shoot these and practice with these. And like I said, this one is a relatively high quality instance of a practice round. Okay, the casing on it is a brass casing, which is what guns are usually designed to shoot, is some kind of brass casing cartridge. So it has a brass case, which is what the guns are designed for, and the bullet itself, we'll see if you guys can see, they're usually called ball rounds, and that's because the tip is usually round, kind of like a ball. And the nice thing about the ball rounds, because they are rounded off, is they typically feed into the gun very well. So these tend to be very reliable, they're very cheap, relatively easy to manufacture, good option for training. However, as cheap as they are, for some people in some situations they're not cheap enough. And so people create alternatives. And one alternative is just simply to decrease the overall production standards. These Remington green and white box rounds, and they have, of course have a number of different calibers that they make them and different bullet weights and those kinds of things. These ones, like I said, are relatively high quality. For practice ammunition, they tend to be relatively consistent in terms of velocity and also point of impact at reasonable self-defense distances. And they also tend to shoot pretty close to a lot of my actual defensive ammunition, and that's an important thing, getting practice ammunition and defensive ammunition that happens to hit in about the same place. And when I talk about caliber, I'll probably talk about that a little bit more, but the main thing that I want to get across right now is that your practice round and whatever round that you need for, that you use for defensive purposes, that you save your life bullet, those need to hit in relatively the same spot. If you have your practice round hits high and your actual defensive round hits low, and you have been, of course, using the practice round to practice, well, when it comes time to save your life, that could result in some major problems. Hitting the intended target where you don't intend to hit them in such a way that the round isn't as effective as it could be. Most time for defensive purposes, when you practice shooting, you're practicing for usually an upper torso hit. If your actual defensive rounds happen to hit lower than your practice ammunition, you're going to wind up potentially shooting someone in the gut, which doesn't stop them very well. It can be very painful, but it usually doesn't stop them nearly as well as an upper torso hit does. If the bullets don't hit in relatively the same spot, it can produce a lot of problems. So that's part of what needs to go into it. But like I said, for some people, rounds like this are just a little too expensive. This is relatively high quality, fairly consistent, works with a lot of defensive loads that are out there, which makes Remington one of the more popular practice rounds that are out there. Somewhat more expensive than others, but just because it tends to work hand in hand with the defensive loads, becomes pretty popular, and a lot of people have found out that the Remington rounds really are, in a lot of cases, the best ones to practice with, just because of how consistent they are. And you can get different bullet weights for a lot of their practice ammunition that will simulate what you're doing with your actual defensive rounds. So you can get the same weight, same kind of recoil, relatively same placements as far as where the shot hits. Makes these rounds really nice, but like I said, sometimes these are just a little too expensive for people. So if you go down a notch, you might wind up with something like this Browning practice round. And Browning is the company that makes these. These are 9mm, 115 grain as well. And at first blush, it doesn't look too terribly different. In my left hand is the Remington round that I was talking about. And in the right is the Browning round that I'm talking about. Superficially, they look very similar. The ends are round, ball ammunition. They both have brass cases. What's the difference? Well, the main difference is in the cleanliness and also the quality control. Remington tends to have fairly high quality control, and that's what leads to these things being fairly consistent when you shoot them, so on and so forth. And the rounds are also relatively clean right out of the box. Browning, on the other hand, they don't usually have quite as great a factory control, and so the amount of powder that's in the casing will sometimes vary a little bit. The bullets might not be exactly the same weight, so on and so forth, so they're not going to shoot quite as consistently. And then also, you can see if I take the two ends and put them together, the Browning in my right hand, you can look at the back end of it, and the back end of the casing will actually appear a little bit duller than the Remington round does. And that is because the back end of the casing sticks out of the little styrofoam insert that they pack these things in, and the boxes and the packaging is not at all even remotely close to airtight, and so the brass will tarnish, and it gets a little film that's on it, and that can cause it to stick and bind. Now, for practice ammunition, that's not a huge deal. If your practice ammunition happens to bind up and stick up a little bit, well, yeah, it's inconvenient, and that it can clog up the gun, create a failure to feed kind of malfunction or something like that, or sometimes a failure to extract. It's really annoying, but if you're just using it in your practice periods, well, you know, that's not a time, at least hopefully, when your life depends on it, so it's not that big of a deal. But this is an ammunition that for some people becomes the way that they can effectively practice. High quality ball rounds can be somewhat expensive. They're much less expensive than actual defensive rounds, but they can be somewhat expensive. So if you take the same basic idea, you have the bullets, you have the casing, you have the primer, take the same basic idea there, but you decrease your quality control, and then you're also not as careful about the packaging, well, you can make it a little bit cheaper, sometimes enough cheaper to make the difference for some people, and you're going to get a product that is going to be very reflect those kinds of changes. Not going to shoot as consistently, and it will have a little bit of a film on the outside just because that brass has been allowed to be exposed to the elements, and it will tarnish a bit. Okay, that happens. But still, not an absolute terrible option, but there are issues with it. Now from there, you can get even less expensive for practice purposes, and this is where rounds like this one come into play. This is a Federal aluminum ball round tip. These are also called full metal jackets because the end of it is completely encased in a copper jacket. And by the way, I didn't say this before, but the reason why they have a copper jacket on them is basically to help protect the barrel from lead fouling. Inside of the bullet is actually lead, and the problem is that if you fire a completely lead projectile down the barrel, that lead is going to get deposited along the barrel, and it's going to foul it up. So if I encase it in copper, the lead is not making direct contact with the barrel anymore. It tends to keep it a lot cleaner, produces a lot fewer problems and that way. And it also can help with accuracy and consistency to a certain extent as well, depending on how it's manufactured, but most of the time it's an issue of maintaining the barrel. The lead is nice and soft, that's inside of the bullet is nice and soft, and so it doesn't tend to scratch up the barrel. The thin copper coating keeps the lead from making direct contact with that barrel, and so reduces fouling. That's why they have copper jackets on most of these. But you'll see that the casing on this one is actually aluminum instead of brass. Aluminum cases tend to be a little bit cheaper to work with, and that can help reduce the cost. Now, personally, I have not found aluminum case ammunition to be a great benefit. Yes, it is less expensive, but aluminum does not behave the same way that brass does in your gun. The explosion goes off, and of course the bullet gets forced out of the barrel, but on the other side of it you have the casing is taking some of that explosive force as well. And the casing, depending on what it's made up of, will expand a certain amount. Brass expands to one level. Aluminum, though, tends to expand more than brass does. And a lot of bullets are designed to work with a certain amount of pressure behind them, and how much the casing expands will greatly determine how much pressure is going to be behind that bullet. Aluminum expands more than brass does, and so what that means is that the pressure with these rounds is not as high. In terms of maintaining the quality of your firearm, that's actually a good thing. The lower the chamber pressures, the less wear and tear there's going to be on your gun. That's good. The problem, though, is that it can be low enough that it will shoot in a significantly different place. And most defensive loads that are out there are not aluminum case loads. Instead, they're going to be some kind of brass load. And so if you have a significantly different pressure from that, in this case a lower pressure than that, you can wind up having a very different point of impact. And that is what I've experienced with my aluminum case rounds that I've tried out, especially these Federal aluminum case ones. They oftentimes will hit in very, very different places than either my regular brass case practice ammo or my defensive rounds. And so if they don't happen to hit close to anything else, they're not really all that useful to me. Now, if you happen to get a defensive round that hits in the same place as these, well, then that works and you can take advantage of the savings. But in my experience, that is very few and far between. I have a number of 9mm guns, and so far I have only found one of them where the aluminum case ammo actually hits close enough to the brass case ammo to make it worthwhile. So yeah, I get aluminum case ammo from time to time, but I really only have one gun that I can run it in. And for you guys, with your guns, there's no guarantee that you're going to have a gun where the aluminum case ammo will shoot close enough to where the brass case ammo does to actually be all that useful. So, is it cheaper? Yes. Does the lower pressure oftentimes reduce the wear and tear on the gun? Yes, it does. But is it enough cheaper to justify the issue of having radically different points of impact? Okay, when I have my practice ammo, I have to remember to shoot over here, and then when I have my real ammo, I have to remember to shoot over here. Not a good thing to be doing. And so for a lot of people, while the aluminum case ammo is cheaper, and like I said, it does put just a little bit less wear and tear on the gun, it's not really worth it. Going down the scale from that to something that's even less expensive is steel case ammunition. Again, this is a practice round. Okay, meant to be something that you can go and practice with at relatively low cost. And these actually do a lot better job of simulating what's going to happen with actual defensive ammunition. Most defensive ammunition is brass case, and steel tends to behave a little bit more like the brass case does than the aluminum. When it expands, it actually does not expand as much as brass does, and so it actually will sometimes produce a little, not a ton, but a little bit more pressure than the brass case ammunition does. And because of that, as long as you're dealing with relatively similar bullet weights, you're usually going to get relatively similar points of impact. And so as a training aid that will allow you to practice with a similar recoil impulse and get a similar point of impact, steel ammunition actually is pretty advantageous in that regard. But there is a downside to it. Yes, it's cheap, and it actually behaves a lot like brass case ammunition does. The problem, though, is that most steel case ammunition can be really hard on guns. The steel case itself is, of course, harder than brass is, and so it's going to be hard on things like the ejector in your gun and things like that, and it can cause that to wear out more quickly. And then the bullets that they load in these are not like the bullets that they load in the other ones. Yes, it is a round nose, but it does not have the same kind of construction. Let me show you guys what I mean. This right here is the bullet from a cartridge that's been fired. And on the back side, you can see the lead core, and then there is a little copper jacket. Now this thickness that you see here is not reflective of the true thickness. It's actually just a little sheet that's been pushed up and crimped around. And so that thickness that you see there is actually part of it being crimped around. It's not actually quite that thick. But mostly lead with a very, 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 very thin copper jacket. That's how most of the practice ammunition is made. And you want most of it, the vast majority of it, to be lead with a very thin copper jacket so that it's not hard on the barrel. Lead is nice and soft. The copper keeps the lead itself off of the metal, but the whole thing is relatively soft, and that keeps it from damaging the barrel. Now, these steel case rounds, their bullet is not made like that. Superficially, it'll look pretty close. Okay, so here's a bullet that is from a steel case round, and superficially it looks pretty close to the regular one. Now this, the steel case round is usually a little bit longer, and I'll talk about why that is in a second. But superficially it looks pretty close until you start looking on the back side. On the back side of the steel case round, you'll see that there's not as much lead in there as you have with a regular round. The regular round has more lead on the inside than the other one does. And the reason for that is that the jacket on these rounds is not made of copper, well, at least not mostly. Instead, their jacket is steel. The reason why they do that is because they're trying to get the round as cheap as possible. Steel case ammunition is usually the cheapest kind of ammunition that you can buy. The whole reason why they make it is because they can make it cheaply. And so the jacket, instead of being copper like a normal round, instead what it is some kind of steel with a very, 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 very thin plating of copper. But most of the thickness of the jacket is actually made up of steel with a very thin copper layer on it. That is very, very hard on barrels. You don't have as much lead in there, and so it's not going to give quite as much as a regular bullet does. And then the primary material that is making contact with the barrel itself is a little itty-bitty microscopic layer of copper with steel right underneath it. Your barrel on your gun is going to be some kind of steel, and you're firing a steel projectile through the steel barrel, steel on steel, and yes, technically there's a very thin copper layer between them, but steel on steel is basically what you have in terms of hardness and flex. That's really not a good thing, and it can ruin the barrel. Now, so a lot of people would look at that and say, well, if this is a round that could ruin my gun, the casing itself can be hard on other parts of the gun like the extractor and whatnot, and the bullet itself is going to tear apart my barrel. Why would I ever buy this round? Yeah, it's cheap, but if it's going to tear up my gun, that's not great. Well, the issue there is how long does it take to tear up the gun? These rounds will usually wind up causing significant damage within somewhere between 5,000 and 6,000 rounds through the gun. Most people who own handguns will not put more than 2,000 rounds through them in the entire lifetime of the gun. So for a lot of people, firing these kinds of rounds through it isn't going to make any difference just because they won't put that many rounds through it in the first place. If you're someone who only goes shooting, 3, maybe 4 times a year, and you are, and never put more than a box of ammunition, like a box of 50, never put more than one of the small boxes of ammunition through the gun each time you take it out, running these isn't really going to make any kind of a difference. You're not going to see enough wear and tear to actually start seeing any of the damage, because like I said, it usually takes 5,000 to 6,000 rounds for these things to do enough damage that it actually becomes significant, noticeable, a point where you would need to replace the barrel, extractor, those kinds of things. If you plan on shooting less than that through your gun over the lifetime that you plan on keeping it, well, then these become a fine option. Another thing to consider is how much cheaper these are relative to the cost of replacing those things. Some guns have a lot of aftermarket support, and it's very easy to get new barrels for them, very easy to replace extractors on. And if you happen to have a gun that's relatively easy to work on and you can get aftermarket parts for it, you might want to look at the differences in costs, because sometimes you can save enough money shooting steel case ammunition that you can still pay for the repairs that will be needed to the gun, like getting a new barrel from time to time, new extractor and things like that, and still wind up saving money. So that is the reason why steel case ammunition works. On one hand, there are people who will not put enough rounds through their gun in order to see the deleterious effects of steel case ammunition. And then on the other hand, there are people out there who have guns that have really good aftermarket support, such that they can get new barrels and they can get new extractors and things like that at a cheap enough cost that they will be able to, with the money that they save from getting the really cheap steel ammunition, be able to cover all of those repairs and still have some left over. So yeah, steel ammunition is definitely hard on your gun, but it's not as bad as you might think it is at first blush. Like I said, if you're someone who doesn't shoot a whole lot, it's cheap and it works. And if you're someone who has a gun that is really easy to find aftermarket parts for, especially in terms of barrels, extractors, things like that, then for you it could also be a real benefit as well. For the rest of us, not so much. And you know, if you happen to shoot a box or two of this through your gun, it's not going to kill anything by itself. Like I said, it usually takes 5,000 to 6,000 rounds. So as an occasional plinking round, it works just fine. Just don't want to give it a steady diet of this stuff for most people. But like I said, if you're someone who doesn't shoot very much in the first place, or you're okay with replacing some parts every now and again, yeah, then it could work for you. Okay, so that takes care of the main kinds of practice ammunition. Is basically just ball ammunition, lead core, copper jacket. You can also have lead core with a steel jacket, which can cause problems, but fairly simple design. Now, if you're going outside to practice and you're going to hit hard targets, or you might have hard things that are out there where you're shooting, there is a potential for ricochets. So ricochet is where the bullet hits a hard surface and it winds up bouncing back towards you. In the desert where I shoot, I'm in southern Idaho, and there's a lot of desert here. It's basically a high desert plateau is basically what southern Idaho is. And so I go out into the desert and I shoot fairly often. And out in the desert there are a lot of rocks. Now where I shoot, I try to make sure that the main place where I shoot is relatively clear of rocks, but underneath the dirt you can't always see what's there, and sometimes there are rocks out there and whatnot. And so out there I do experience ricochets. And a ricochet bullet, once it's been fired, will sometimes look something like this. Okay, so just comparison here. Here is a normal bullet that is not ricocheted, it's just gone into the dirt or whatever. And then this one is a ricocheted bullet. It has hit something, been smooshed in, and then whatever it hit, it bounced off of. So hit a rock or something like that. A lot of people will use steel targets. You can get ricochets off of those. And if the bullet stays relatively intact like this one did, that can come back at you, and that can cause serious problems. That can be a major risk to your health, we'll say. Now, when ricochets come back, they don't usually come back with nearly the same velocity that they left at, but that does not mean that they're not dangerous. Obviously, if it comes back and it hits you in the eye, that's going to be a major problem. But a lot of people don't think about other relatively soft parts of the body that these can damage. One of the biggest areas is your neck. So if you're standing there shooting and you happen to hit something hard that's out there and it comes back, well, it could hit you in the eye. That's a problem. And that's where part of why a lot of people, when they're shooting, they will wear eye protection. But there are other parts of your body that can be very, very exposed, like your neck. And even if this isn't coming back with a whole lot of velocity, your neck is very, very, very delicate, and getting a piece of ricochet bullet stuck in your neck can really ruin your day very quickly. So what's the solution to that? The solution to that is fairly simple: distance. Like I said, ricochets don't usually come back with nearly the same velocity that they left at in terms of leaving the barrel. And so if you stay a good distance away from them, from whatever your target is, you're generally going to reduce the risk of a bad ricochet considerably. The recommendation that most manufacturers will put on their products that are hard products like steel clangers and things like that, the recommended distance that a lot of them will put on there is 30 yards. And it's very hard to get a ricochet bouncing back more than 30 yards. That is definitely true, and there's a reason why most manufacturers do that. The only problem is that 30 yards is well beyond what most people can really reliably do with a handgun. Most people aren't very accurate, and I've said this in the past, beyond about 15 yards. So if you have to be at least 30 yards away from your target, that's not super great. Well, turns out there's a solution for that too, and that is where bullets like these come into play. This is not a 9mm round anymore. This is instead 22 Magnum, but you'll see the end of it has a little bit of exposed lead, but most of the bullet has a copper jacket on it, like most normal bullets do. This is what is called a soft point projectile. The idea behind a soft point projectile in its use as target ammunition is that the soft point will hit the target first, get shoved basically back into the casing, spread the casing out, and deliver all of its energy pretty much right there, instead of maintaining its overall weight. This one didn't maintain its shape very well, but it maintained most of its weight, and that's what makes it very dangerous. This one, these ones, they hit and they flatten out, disintegrate, and much safer at closer distances. So if you're dealing with relatively hard targets at relatively close distances, I still wouldn't say that you should get closer than 10 yards if you're dealing with hard targets. But if you want to be able to deal with them at closer than 30 yards, getting some kind of soft point projectile can be a really good idea. Oftentimes still used as a target ammunition, but if you're shooting in a place that has a lot of rocks, or if you're using hard targets like some kind of steel target, having a soft point projectile can be a really, really great thing in terms of safety. Now, the soft point projectiles also have an application in hunting, in that the soft point will allow the bullet to deform a little bit, which will make the bullet produce a fairly effective wound channel, but it won't greatly change the overall mass of the bullet as it moves through the animal. And so you'll get good penetration, good wound cavity, makes it a fairly effective hunting round. So soft points can be very useful when you're dealing with hard targets, if you're in an area that has a lot of rocks, or you're dealing with like steel targets, something like that. And it can also be useful in hunting because it will produce a fairly effective wound track while still getting full penetration through the animal. Okay, just as I mentioned. Okay. All right, but last, but certainly not least, and I know the video has gone on long, we need to talk about the defensive rounds. Okay. And I'll try to throw these in here relatively quick. Defensive rounds for pistols basically come in two varieties. First variety, I have a couple of examples here, and they are hollow points. And they're named hollow points because the tip of them has a little hole in there. The little tip is hollow, therefore they're called hollow points. Okay, some of the hollow points will have brass cases. Some of them will have a nickel-plated case. I in the past have called these nitride cases. That's not technically true. There's another process that you can do that involves silver nitride that will make them this color, and so I kerfuffled it. But technically this is actually nickel plating. And between the two, either brass case or nickel plated casing for defensive rounds, I prefer the nickel plating because it tends to hold up a lot better. A lot of times with my defensive handguns, I'll only have them loaded when they're actually on me, when they're actually in my holster. And if I take my gun off, I unload it. That's good, safe gun handling. If you have a gun that's not in use, there's no good reason for it to be unloaded. Sorry, for it to be loaded, and therefore it should be unloaded. Well, in order to unload it, you're going to have to take the round out of the chamber, and when you load it, you're going to put it back in chamber. And if you do this on a fairly regular basis, like daily, it can really tear up the casing. And just looking at the two, you'll notice a lot more scuff marks on the brass case. This is one that I've had in guns multiple times, in and out, in and out, in and out. And the same thing with the silver one, the nickel-plated one. It's been in my gun a lot of times as well, in and out, in and out, in and out. And you'll notice that as far as how much scuffing and general wear and tear on it, the brass casing does have more. See if you guys can see the difference there. Yeah. But yeah, the brass cases do not tend to take the wear and tear nearly as well as the nickel-plated cases do. They're not terrible, and as long as you don't leave them, as long as you eventually shoot them up and you don't use them indefinitely. For brass case stuff, I would really recommend that you trade it out at least every 6 months, just because, like I said, the brass cases don't hold up as well. The nickel-plated cases, I would go longer. I would say that you could go a full year before you have to trade this stuff out, just because it holds up better. And then also another issue to think about is the overall design of the hollow points. This one that I have in my right hand one, the brass case one, has a very, very, very flat profile to the bullets. And in some guns, that functions just fine. Ultimately, you're going to have to test in your gun and see what works. But that flat profile can produce problems in some guns. And then as the bullet comes up to the chamber, the angle at which it meets the chamber can actually be exact enough that it'll actually get stuck as it's coming up into the chamber. It'll just sit there and rest, and that can cause problems. Now, this particular one takes the angle all the way back to where it meets the casing, and so that usually doesn't cause problems. But some of them, they don't go all the way back to the casing. Instead, the angle will stop short of the casing, and those ones can cause some pretty interesting jams pretty often. And so if you have a flat-sided hollow point like this, just be aware that that can be an issue. Another thing to consider is the size of the hollow point itself. If you typically have a fairly small hollow point like this one is, compared to the other one, just looking at the ends, this one's hole is a lot smaller than my nickel-plated one here. My nickel-plated one has a pretty big size hole. And that tends to indicate at what speed these are meant to open up. These are defensive rounds, and what happens is that when some kind of fluid enters into that little cavity, the bullet will actually expand out. So just to give you guys an example of that, here is a .22 Magnum round that expanded out. And just to give you an idea of how much expanded, I'll show you the back side of it. This little copper piece right here is the back end of the bullet, and then the rest of it around that is the expansion. So this was a hollow point, and the opening got filled with a fluid-like material, shoved it apart, and it produced this really, really wide bullet in compared to its original diameter. Original diameter is just that little copper circle there, and it got expanded out to nearly twice that size. That's what hollow points do. They expand out the bullet, produces a larger wound track. That's why they're used for defense, is because it produces a bigger wound, than these round ones do. These round bullets don't tend to produce a very large wound track. Still going to hurt, it can still definitely kill you, but it's not as effective as one of these hollow points. Bullet starts out pretty small, enters a fluid, becomes much, much, much larger. Now, what determines how well they open up at what speed is basically the size of the hole in the front. A very small hole means that it has to be moving at relatively high speed. A relatively wide hole means relatively slow speed. So between these two rounds, I can tell which one's going to work best in which gun. If I have a relatively short barrel gun, which tends to produce lower velocities, I'm going to go for the one with the bigger opening. If I have a higher velocity gun, like a full-length handgun or something like that, or even something beyond a full-length handgun like a pistol caliber carbine or something like that, I'm going to go for the one that has the smaller opening, because it's designed to work at the higher speeds that those longer barrels will tend to produce. Now, technically, if you get a barrel too long, you'll actually start decreasing speed, but for most people, under practical circumstances, little opening means high-speed gun, full-size gun. Big opening means low-speed gun, short barrel gun. Okay, big opening, short barrel. Small opening, longer barrel. Okay. And then, as I mentioned, The brass cases can sometimes get chewed up, and putting them into and out of the gun, loading and unloading your gun. The nickel-plated cases tend to do better. Okay, so that's one kind of defensive ammunition, is the hollow points. The other kind of defensive ammunition that is out there is the monolithic. A monolithic can look somewhat close to a regular ball round. I'll go ahead and grab my regular ball round here. All right, here's a regular ball round. Here's a monolithic. They look pretty similar. There's no opening on the front of it like there is on the hollow point. They can be somewhat confusable, but they behave very differently in the intended targets. Ball rounds, when they tend to enter flesh, you're using it usually to defend against people. When a ball round enters flesh, it just punches a little hole through it. Like I said, it definitely will hurt. It can kill you, but usually relatively small little hole, and doesn't do a whole lot. Monolithics, on the other hand, have a very different construction, and that the bullet is one solid piece of copper. That's why they're called monolithic. It's just one substance. It's not lead with a copper coating. It is all copper. And so these bullets tend to be very light. They're not very dense at all, because copper is not nearly as dense as lead is. Lead's what the bullet is usually mostly made out of. So they're not very dense, and so they don't tend to have the tendency to over-penetrate like ball ammunition does. Ball ammunition tends to go through just about anything in terms of common substances. It's not uncommon for a ball round to be capable of being shot through one person, then continuing into a second person and exiting the second person. That's not uncommon with ball rounds at all. But if I get a much lighter bullet, and specifically a much less dense bullet, that is not as likely to happen. And then on top of that, a monolithic bullet does not tend to deform as easily. And so what that means is that it's usually going to deliver more energy to the target instead of energy being put into deforming it. For example, with a normal ball round, if it happens to hit something hard in the intended target, like say a rib or something like that, it can deform. This is a bullet that just scraped along the side of something that was hard, and it wound up squishing the bullet. So just for comparison, regular bullets over here, and then squished bullet that got brushed up against something relatively hard. And what happens there is a lot of the energy that the bullet is carrying will be redirected into itself. It will be redirected into changing the bullet's shape, instead of being directed into the targets. Monolithics, on the other hand, don't do that. So the monolithic, here's a bullet that came out of one of the monolithics. This bullet is completely solid copper. It does not deform very easily at all. And so the energy is delivered almost entirely to the target, not to reshaping the bullet. The bullet will almost always retain exactly the same shape that it left with. Now, this one has been exposed to the elements, and so it's tarnished, and that's why it's a darker color than the bullet that's still in the casing. But the nice thing about it is, like I said, these ones do not deform hardly at all. Yes, technically, if you strike something that's hard enough with them, you can eventually get them to deform. But in terms of regular targets, with the intended target, these are not going to hit anything in there that's going to deform them, which means that the energy that they deliver is all going to go into the target material. And because they're not very dense, copper is not nearly as dense as lead, they don't tend to have the same potential for over-penetration that regular ball ammunition does. So that's another kind of defensive round. So hollow points tend to expand when they're in the target, well beyond their original diameter sometimes, produces a really big hole. That's what hollow points do. And then monolithics are not very dense, and so they don't tend to have the potential for over-penetration. And on top of that, they're very, very, very hard, and that delivers a lot of energy to the target itself instead of into deforming the bullets. Accomplishes basically the same goal in a different way. And depending on where you are, sometimes the monolithics are perfectly legal, while the hollow points are not. Hollow points are usually cheaper, easier to get a hold of, but in certain jurisdictions, they're not legal. In those jurisdictions, a monolithic can be a great option because they still deliver pretty good performance. They don't over-penetrate. They deliver a lot of energy to the targets, but because they don't expand, they're not under the same restrictions that the hollow points are. Right, and that's why both forms exist, basically, is because of legal considerations a lot of times. And then sometimes the monolithics do have some properties that the hollow points won't have. For example, monolithics tend to get through barriers better than the hollow points do. But like I said, the hollow points are usually much more available and considerably cheaper. All right, so that is the basics of handgun bullets and cartridge types. We've talked about training ammunition, inert training ammunition, dummy rounds. We've talked about ball rounds. We've talked about some of the different forms of ball rounds with different cases and what they can do for you in terms of saving cost, either the aluminum case or the steel case. We've talked about what to do if you're dealing with an area that has hard targets. Soft points can be a great option. They can also be a good option for hunting. We also talked about defensive cartridges, the hollow points, and we talked about the advantages of a nickel plating. Typically holds up a little bit better, doesn't tend to get scratched and dinged as much as the brass cases do. We also mentioned that a large opening tends to indicate that this is meant for a shorter barrel, and small opening tends to indicate that this is meant for a longer barrel. Typically, not every single case, but typically that's the way that it works out the best. And then we also talked about another defensive kind of ammunition, and that is the monolithic bullet. Doesn't expand at all, but because it's monolithic, it does not tend to deform very much, and so it delivers a lot of energy on target. And because the density is not nearly as high as lead, it does not tend to penetrate as much as a regular ball round would. All right. So those are the basic cartridge types. We've seen the advantages and disadvantages. I hope that was useful to you guys and instructive, informative. Have a good one. Bye.